to begin by welcoming, of course, our guest over here, Geetha, who actually needs no introduction, because all of you have come because we all know about Geetha's really incredible scholarship. Again, what I was just chatting with her outside the frame of the university, in areas of the politics of caste, the areas of gender, the looking at the question of the human rights movement, looking at the work of balagopal, a range of really areas which she's engaged with very, very deeply. And why we were so keen on having this talk with her, looking at looking at Ambedkar and balagopal together, is because the last discussion which we had when we were looking at the book Ear to the Ground, the question which came up again and again is what was the link between Balagopal and his engagement with Ambedkar's thought. And one opinion which came across was that he was engaging closely with Ambedkar, but unfortunately left us too early. So we didn't get a full sense of what that engagement really was. And again, then we thought of that, how do you take that discussion forward? We could think of no better person than Geetha, who's actually engaged so closely with both Ambedkar and with the work of Balagopal. Her engagement with Ambedkar, those of you who haven't seen it, the latest book is called Ambedkar and the Question of Socialism. Again, a really fantastic book. If you get a chance, please do read it. It's not many people have looked at it closely, but I think it deserves a very close reading. And of course, her work on Balagopal, we have Ajanta is here with the book Ear to the Ground, which again is a work which looks particularly at the question of caste and Balagopal's thinking of the question of caste. On that one line which I just have to quote because it's a favorite line, is there's an essay in that called Caste and the Law, in which Balagopal says, I was given the topic, again in his typical style, I was given the topic caste and the law maybe because I'm a lawyer, but in India caste is the law. 3 lines, he told you everything you need to know about caste and the law. So that's Balagopal's work, and I'll leave it now to Geetha to take the conversation forward. Thank you very much. Again, one last point, we've been trying very hard to get Geetha to ALF for many years. For whatever reason, it never worked out. For the first time, it's actually worked out. So after 25 years, I think. So pleased to have you here.
Thanks a lot, Arvind. So I'm going to actually start on a biographical note, another autobiographical note. I think this was 1993, if I can remember right. I was part of a feminist collective in Chennai called Snaidi. We worked on domestic violence related matters, and we worked with the Tamil Nadu State Legal Aid Board. And many of us in the collective were also members of PUCL at that time. And APCLC had organized a convention in Visakhapatnam on gender and human rights. I mean, that was a broad topic. I forget the actual title of the colloquium, and we were invited as members of a women's group for that, not as members of PUCL. And sadly, I never made it because it was one of those monsoon years when storms keep threatening our coast all the way from Nagapattinam to Kakinada to wherever. So all the trains were cancelled, and we sat all night in the central station waiting for one of those Kolkata trains to take us there. We just didn't make it. But I wanted to start with that because it was a rather unusual invitation. While we all knew each other in the realm of civil liberties work, APCLC was holding this especially on the question of gender. And prior to this, in 1989, they had put out a fact-finding report on dowry deaths in Andhra Pradesh, I think. Some work had been done and it had been published. Around the same time, PUDR had also engaged with the question of violence in the family, and I think they also did a report, if I'm not mistaken. And generally, and Deepa is here, she knows this as well, from the 70s onwards, there was such a burst of thinking and acting around feminist issues in undivided Andhra Pradesh, especially with Hyderabad as its hub. There was Sri Shakti Sangatna, there was a Hyderabad feminist study circle, there were individuals unattached but who were feminists, and a lot of issues were being raised around gender and violence and gender and the law, every conceivable thing. And then when that famous book was published, we were making history on the Telangana armed struggle and women's role in it. It raised a number of questions for the left in not just Andhra but the rest of India, women's participation in these struggles, and then when the unilateral call to pull back from armed violence and, you know, the party returned to parliamentary politics, the women were all returned home. And that was such a huge shock and disappointment for many of them, who had led incredibly active lives over the last 3 or 4 years. Anyway, in short, gender was in the air in a very big way. And in the mid-90s, Andhra also witnessed this amazing anti-arid struggle, which involved a huge number of rural women, because N.T. Ramarao had made a bold promise he would impose prohibition, and there was a lot of pressure from the ground. In view of all this, gender had become something very central to how people define their own politics, including the far left. And civil liberties groups were no exception, and APCLC had done that report and then organized this convention. And I think at that time, many of us who were in feminist collectives were also, of course, part of many other kinds of campaigns. There was no Chinese wall between all these various realms. And this was, as you know, the decade of Mandal, the decade of Masjid, the decade of early neoliberalism and all of that. So there was a lot of tension, a lot of anguish, there was a lot of thinking through issues which could not be kept separate all that easily. For Tamil Nadu, I can speak with some confidence, and I know that we were sort of moving across various activist spaces, even though we were primarily a feminist collective. So PUCL work on the one hand, and then Advani's Rath Yatra, which sort of, you know, went down this long trail of blood across the country. That had dragged us all into anti-communal work. Then that decade, both in Andhra and Tamil Nadu, witnessed violence against Dalits, unprecedented violence. It started with Karam Chedu in Andhra, and in Tamil Nadu, every decade since independence has seen violence against Dalits, and the 80s were particularly bad. So, any case, we were all part of all these spaces, but at the same time, we were also feminists in a very fundamental way. So, while we were in PUCL, the question would often arise amongst us younger women, what does it mean to do civil rights work with a feminist perspective? Is it that you listen to as many women as you do to men? Is there any other way you can frame it? So something like what APCLC tried to do spoke to us in some ways, though we didn't make it for that convention. They sent us a report and everything, and it was basically that it's not just state violence that ought to be the focus of attention for civil rights groups. There is also societal violence, and how might one address that? And in fact, very early on, if I remember right again, 79, Madhu Kishwar in a previous avatar, I mean, literally it seems like an avatar now, wrote this phenomenal essay on women and human rights, where she took each one of the fundamental rights and showed how it was routinely sort of violated as far as women's lives were concerned. So there was a lot of thinking on that subject that had emerged from amongst women's groups. But it hadn't really been picked up by the civil rights groups across the country until APCLC made that move. And for Balagopal, I think it was a very important move in terms of expanding the remit of civil rights work. And as he often recalled much later, one of the most epiphanic moments for him about rethinking civil rights was after Karam Chedu, when young Dalit activists came to, and you know this, some of you have read that piece, know it, and you've heard him on one of his talks would know this. Young Dalit men asked him, how is it it's only police violence that's always an issue for the civil libertarians? What about caste and untouchability? Shouldn't that actually also be something you address? And I think APCLC carried out 2 fact-finding sort of sessions in Karam Chedu, and of course, as he would also point out later, they did very consciously look at the violence of caste. And he would go on to say, the very existence of caste is a violation of civil rights. Just as caste is the law, caste is also therefore a violation of rights. So that had already sort of got him to think about all of this very differently. And so therefore, when this whole women's movement things that came from the ground also pushed the civil rights agenda, as far as APCLC was concerned. But I don't think PUDR picked it up to some extent, but neither CPDR, OPDR or the PUCL did as much as one could have expected them to do around that time. But I think what I want to do therefore is to ask ourselves through Balagopal's writings, and then I'll come to Ambedkar as well, what is it that stopped us from addressing these issues as issues of importance? Why didn't we see caste as a violation of rights? How is it that the violence that women faced at home, how was it a no matter thing? I mean, I don't want to get into some long-winding analysis, but I just want to do a very quick historical reprise. If you look at the evolution of the civil rights movement, there are two broad traditions one can speak about. One is, of course, the kinds of protests that emerged during the anti-colonial struggle against the restrictions of life and liberties. And here you can go through all your conspiracy cases, Kanpur, Meerut, and all of that. The other one is, of course, what Manoj Mehta has very scrupulously chronicled, the struggle against denial of rights to segments of the population, rights of access to public resources, public roads, to temples, to property, to education. Even if it was guaranteed by rule and law, this was routinely denied. And how did these populations respond, especially Dalit legislators who were nominated by the colonial state, and also Dalit movements from the ground. So that's the other tradition that one can legitimately claim for civil rights. Unfortunately, that tradition has never been a part of the genealogy of civil rights activism in this country. And Balagopal would, of course, talk about that much later. He said if we had started with Ambedkar and caste, we would have a very different history of civil rights. But we started with this I think, against police violence, state violence. But of course, it's worth asking, why was that so? It's not that one wishes to lighten the question of state violence. Indeed, we cannot. But I think it's an interesting history to think about as well, because one of the things you realize is that if you look at the anti-colonial struggles against the system of that time, the legal system, and I'll just limit myself to the Meerut conspiracy case, because that generated the largest documentation. The defendants wrote their defense for 1,500 and odd pages, I think, and they demanded every sort of proscribed Marxist literature in the country to aid their defense, which, to the credit of the colonial government, was given to them, unlike what our mean-minded government does with prisoners' rights to reading. So, interestingly, if you look at that and you look backwards, how does one understand how anti-colonial activists and thinkers responded to the curtailment of political liberties? One thing is, of course, it's very evident from, say, to take two individuals as different as Tilak and Gandhi, you will see that for both of them, colonial law was constitutively illegitimate. They didn't feel that they had to respect this law. Colonial law was illegitimate. Gandhi, of course, did it from a kind of a communitarian, anarchist point of view. Tilak openly said, I don't have to respect these laws. These are not laws that were made with our consent. Fair enough. So the challenging of the colonial legal system was very central to anti-colonial politics in some ways. And in the Meerut conspiracy case, my favorite part is this, in Dange or somewhere, I forget which one this is, but basically they are trying to argue against sedition and for waging war against the king emperor. And they have this wonderful, sort of really complicated argument how they're actually not waging war against the king emperor, they're not being seditious, but they believe in a political philosophy which makes it imperative for them to challenge colonialism. They also see it as a temporary stage in the historical evolution towards socialism. So they basically sort of have this huge lecture on the socialist framework, on the socialist vision of history, and that as they move towards that revolutionary goal, they are forced to do certain things which might be construed to be waging war against the king emperor and as sedition. It's a fantastic argument, you have to read it, which is interesting for my purpose, because what it indicates to us is that that sort of challenging the state has a very old history here, and it's rooted in actual struggles and in actual things that people did with the law. This is back in the 1920s. The conspiracy case went on for a long time, as you all know. So I think this history is important for us to keep in mind, and it is from this history then you see the sorts of agendas that emerged for the civil rights movement. And again, to go back to some more historical facts, 1947, of course, independence and all of that. 1948, the Bengal province, a Public Security Act is enacted, which is more or less a precursor of many of these draconian laws that would emerge later. 48, the Communist Party is banned, and the ban stays on till 52. There's police action in Hyderabad. There's a toppling of an elected government in Kerala. So you see a number of non-legal activities on the part of the Indian state, which then of course builds up its own challenge. Initially it's you see Telangana, Tebaga, all of that till the 50s. The 50s are a relatively quiet decade in terms of challenging the state, but the memory of those years remain in all these areas where the state had indulged in repression and where to challenge it became very imperative to protect the republic itself, so to speak. So it is that history that comes alive again in the Naxalbari decade and continues with the emergency, and then when you have this Naxalite upsurge in the Andhra region and in Bihar and eastern UP, then the violation of rights of the revolutionaries and of whoever is associated with them becomes a central agenda for the civil rights movements of that time. Now this is a legitimate history, I don't think we would quarrel with this history, but that becomes the measure of civil rights activism. Now in the context of Karam Chedu, in the context of issues raised by women's groups, and also the different kinds of social movements that were very active in the late 70s and 80s, the farmers' movement, for example, the ecological movements that had emerged, the Dalit Panthers. So it was very evident that no one can fully lay claim to a revolutionary history on their own. That everybody that was protesting were also claiming that they were breaking with custom, with tradition, and they were wanting to remake society. But state violence was of course not trained against them as much as it was against the Naxalites and the revolutionary left across India. So there was a set of, let us say, competing human rights interests, and it is at this point that you have Balagopal trying to sort of rethink the meaning of civil liberties itself, and how civil liberties cannot be sort of seen only in terms of this narrative of communist revolution, that whatever you do must inevitably lead you towards a path of revolution. And if you're defending the rights of individuals who are targeted by the state, Naxalite leaders, activists, whoever, then you're doing so because you are invested in the revolution. And there was a very thin line between APCLC activists and the far left. And Balgopal, I think from the early 90s was very clear that that line has to be thicker. It can't be so thin. And so that was the beginning of this rethinking of civil liberties. And in conceptual terms, in philosophical terms, basically you have him saying that people might ask for a right in very specific contexts, out of particular circumstances, particular struggles. But each such right is constantly renewed. When people work with what has been articulated before, and if it has been made into some sort of a law, then that law becomes the context for rethinking other struggles also. So no right is simply only meant for the purpose for which it was advocated. Rights are actually a cumulative body of guarantees which are civilizationally significant. They add to the storehouse of values that we create as a civilization. He uses that word in more places than one. And why does he do that? Because in the lexicon of the far left or all left parties, rights that you fight for are okay. You have a constitution which allows you to fight for these rights. It's okay to fight, but don't be fooled that these rights can get you anywhere. These are, after all, bourgeois democratic rights. You can secure some things with them, but ultimately what are important are broader rights. The right to the redistribution of property, of redistribution of wealth as such, and so on. So that being the case, any struggle for rights was always seen by the left in instrumental terms. That you will do this, yes, but we're doing this with this knowledge, we've got to get these men out of prison, or we've got to stop the police from, ignoring Article 21. So these were the ways in which it was thought to be used, and all the civil rights groups of those days, perhaps, except perhaps the PUCL, had a very strong far left component. All of them did. So it was in this context that Balgopal made a different case for human rights, that they are of civilizational significance. Just because they were articulated by the bourgeois does not mean that they represent the rights of that class. And here he was taking on some very fundamental truisms that the left believed in. That rights are not bourgeois. Rights are civilizationally valid across time, and rights are renewed each time there's a struggle. So that was one argument. But I think what's important is at the same time, remember this is also Mandal stuff, this is also, so much is being said about caste in the public realm. And I think Balgopal started reading Ambedkar very seriously around this time. I certainly know that he was very interested in the caste question because when we gave him our book on the non-Brahmin millennium, he finished it in 3 days. And then he sent us all an 8-page essay on it. So the book was 600 pages. Or a book on Periyar. No? So obviously he was thinking about caste and many other things that one ought to think about in the context of all that was happening, and that's evident in many of the essays, anti-Mandal mania, all the things that rocked Andhra Pradesh at that time. All of that is explained in ear to the ground in many of those essays. Now, what could he have been, what did he draw from Ambedkar is a useful question. I mean, I'm not going to go into speculation here. I want to shift to Ambedkar himself, because I think it's very, very important to understand Ambedkar as a lawyer and as a constitutionalist. Because the constitution is on all our lips these days, but what does it mean to say, the constitution? And I would like to start with Ambedkar's definition of democracy. I'll come back to that, but just one small thing before that. So when Balagopal was doing all of this stuff about redefining rights, let's not forget that two other things were happening. APCLC was picking up other issues besides that of the revolutionaries being jailed, incarcerated or tortured. The range of civil rights issues was expanding as well. And if you read Balagopal's essays, you will see that every essay is a corresponding campaign that the APCLC had carried out. So base campaign or case that they had taken up, which means that he sees human rights work is also an exercise in critical pedagogy. That you're doing something on the ground, you're filing a case or you're doing whatever it is. But then you also have to explain to people what is it you're doing and why are you doing this. So if this is Andhra Pradesh in the 80s and 90s, and it's, as I said earlier, neoliberal capital and the emergence of non-Congress governments in Andhra Pradesh with N.T. Ramarao and all of that. These are non-Brahmin governments also, but what do we have on the ground? What is unfolding? How do you understand it? So you have him criticizing NTR, you have him criticizing Chandrababu Naidu, Y. Rajshekhar Reddy, all the doyens of Andhra politics, Mrs. Gandhi and the emergency years. So basically he's also annotating civil rights practice by placing it within a broad historical and social analysis. He's doing that also at this time. So you see him doing civil rights work at several levels therefore, and through all of this he wants to sort of convey to us, fellow citizens, now these are the reasons why you can't take the word democratic rights lightly. It's not about bourgeois democracy. This is not about bourgeois democracy. This is really about fundamental norms and values that are necessary for building a decent society, and which we can legitimately call democratic in a fundamental sense. So I think it is here that Ambedkar would have become very important for him in this context. Now, and as I often said, Ambedkar is of course one of our greatest fighters against caste, and he addresses caste as in terms of its constitutive illegitimacy, its inequality, but he also addresses caste as a democrat. So if you bring together Ambedkar's sense of democracy and Ambedkar's anti-caste work, this is a legacy that the civil rights movement should inherit. But of course that was tantalizing. He didn't go on to say how they should inherit it, and then of course he went and died. So I never forgive him for dying. So, but one can go back to Ambedkar to understand what this could mean, because I think Ambedkar himself, if you think of Ambedkar's understanding of democracy, of course, in its most expansive sense, he called it, it's a way of life. It is nothing specific to political society alone. It's a way of life. And for him, it was a way of life which stood to countermand what he called the Hindu social order. It's very interesting. He doesn't only say caste, he calls it the Hindu social order. That adjective is very important for him. That it's a Hindu social order. And to counter it, you need democracy. So at one level, that was not simple, but that was the sort of opposition. But at another level, democracy also with a smaller d. It meant practical democratic politics. And he went on to redefine how that politics ought to look and how that politics ought to be. And from the point of view of the Dalits. Now, when Balagopal says that every specific struggle is transvalued into a universal norm, which is why these rights are important. So if you look at Ambedkar's thought, you see how he actually creates this transvaluing. I'm just going to take you very quickly through some examples. So his first public statement on the Dalit condition, if we can call it that, was the evidence before the South Borough Commission, set up by the colonial government to sort of find out should Indians be included into whatever rule colonial whatever reform legislator there was going to be, who should be voting, who should be standing for elections, blah blah. Should Dalits be nominated? Should Dalits actually stand for elections? Can we have Dalit voters? Because the qualification for being a voter was property and education, and Dalits had neither at that time. Higher education, not school education. So what do you do then? These were all discussions, and Ambedkar produced a written affidavit. He also appeared in person. Now that's the first time he actually defines the Dalit condition. He says who needs rights. Supposing, because you had all these electoral constituencies, merchants, the labor, you had graduates. They were all electoral constituencies at that time. So Ambedkar says anyone can represent a merchant. It doesn't matter if it's Hindu, Muslim or Parsi. It's the rights of the merchants that constituency will address. But he says the question of Dalits is very different, and their interests are greater than even the interests of property, he says. Don't forget, he's addressing a bourgeois liberal colonial state, and the word property means something to them. So the interests of property are very central to that state. But Ambedkar argues that the interests that I'm speaking for are greater than those of property, because Dalits have their very person confiscated. That's a very powerful terminology. And I think this word confiscation is, Arvind has heard this before, but this confiscation is a very interesting term, because he was he was a good student of African American politics and history, as we know. And confiscation was a term often used with regard to the slave trade. I mean, they're confiscated, basically, and they're brought as slaves. So Dalits have their very person confiscated. So you have him starting a way of talking about Dalits that would explain to the world at large, especially India's colonial rulers, who only have anthropology and other stuff to go by to understand the caste system. And look, this is a matter of human rights. These are people who are being denied their humanity itself. So they are robbed of their personhood. That's one definition. Then sometime later, he moves into another kind of domain. So this is existential, right? They're robbed of their personhood. Then the next is the legal domain. They are a minority, he says. But they are unlike other minorities. They are not linguistic minorities. They are not like religious minorities. They are actually an oppressed minority, which must be the first time anyone's used a term like that. All minorities are oppressed at some level, but they are an oppressed minority in themselves. So he's using the language of majority minorities to secure guarantees for the Dalits. And I think legally that's very interesting, because basically what he wanted colonial government to do was that grant statutory rights to Dalits, grant statutory guarantees. It's not enough to say that Dalits can stand for election. Create the modalities wherein they have to stand for election. So the whole idea of democracy and representation acquires a completely new meaning. So when you have an oppressed minority, how is that minority to be represented in your legislature? Is it going to be territorial? Ambedkar says no, it's got to be something else. Then he comes up with separate electorates, all of that. But basically, in terms of understanding rights, he makes us rethink what does it mean to elect somebody? What does it mean for A to represent B? Where A is representing all of us, who should A be? So as far as Dalits are concerned, he feels nobody else can represent them, because nobody else is considered untouchable. And how is anyone to know what that experience means? So their interests can best be expressed by somebody who has endured that condition. So he says no nomination, Dalits have to vote, Dalits have to be elected. So that's his thing. So that's at the level of he makes a minority argument. And then during the roundtable conferences, he's in London. He's talking to the British government. Southborough, Simon, or to the British Indian government. Both those governments are separate, they're distinct. They're connected, but they're distinct. And these fellows here know us to some extent. But those fellows there know some things, but not many things. He's addressing, in other words, a larger audience, a sort of a cosmopolitan audience. So he opens his remarks by saying the condition of the untouchable is neither like the serf, nor like the villain, nor that of a slave. It's fantastic, because he's taking terms from world history. I mean, the word serf has particular resonance because of the whole abolition of serfdom in Soviet Russia in the wake of the revolution. English history is full of references to serfs, villains, and so on. So he's using terms that they would understand and place the Dalit predicament in front of them. And here also he's saying that they're not like any of these categories. They're very different. Apart from being economically marginalized and oppressed, they are also suffering from religious sanction. The custom and social behavior renders them permanently untouchable. So their condition is unique. And he would go on to define that uniqueness in diverse ways. After some time, in the late 30s, he would talk about, are they like the African American states? No. Yes and no. African American states, they really touch the conscience of at least some white people. Does it touch anyone's conscience here? This is taken for granted. Then in the 40s, he would compare them to the ghettoized Jews of Europe. So he was constantly looking for broad ways of understanding this condition. And I think, how do you construct the Dalit as a bearer of rights? You have to understand Dalit suffering to understand the nature of that suffering, to proclaim their identity as a bearer of rights. Because in the Indian context, and we know it's true to this day, there's a certain way in which we consider Dalit bodies disposable, whether it's the ubiquitous sewer deaths that we see or any number of everyday things that we see. So in that sense, I think that to make a case for them as rights-bearing subjects, he invokes local history, world history. So he's basically trying to sort of help you understand in the Indian context, you can't take democracy lightly in that manner. You're up against a system which thinks it's perfectly okay to treat people as untouchable. It's fine. No one has any qualms here. So how do you create some sort of a, some sense of a public conscience, as you would call it, or a social conscience around this issue? So you see him doing that throughout that period. That's something that's very, very important for us to remember, because basically I think for him democracy can be real and fulsome only if it takes this particular predicament of the Dalit seriously and places the Dalit subject of the republic at the heart of your understanding of democracy. Otherwise you have not understood democracy. And very interestingly, if you, I mean, all of you are lawyers, you're familiar with the Atrocities Act. I think he was one of the first to make a case for state liability. The state has to assume liability if it does not do some things as it is meant to do. And that is something he puts forth in his memorandum that he and R. Srinivasan prepare and give to the first roundtable conference. In fact, that's a fantastic constitutional document also. I'm glad that the internet has finally put it up as part of the constitutional history. It was not there until 6 months ago. So, in that sense, there's a complete rethinking of democracy and what can it mean in the Indian context. I think Balagopal would have certainly followed some of these arguments that Ambedkar had made and was making, and so on and so forth. And the other thing is, other very, very important thing is, this whole definition of democracy is on one hand. But the challenge for Ambedkar was, how do you build democracy in India? Because if it is all of this, you can secure statutory rights, you can secure statutory liabilities which the state has to incur on the behalf of the Dalits, whether it is special schemes, whether it is separate electorates, whatever it is. But then, as he said very memorably during the Simon Commission hearings, when somebody asks him, actually it is Clement Attlee, the future Prime Minister of England, who asks him, but do you think that you're asking for all these statutory things, if these are granted, would the condition of Dalits improve? He said, you can't make a man love his neighbor through an act of legislature. You can't do that. That is what is required for the Dalits to actually come into the full sense of their rights. But you can't do that. But little short of that, you can provide certain kinds of legal safeguards that would make it difficult for people to practice untouchability. So the sense of what could be secured in law was also very precise. Not more, not less. But certainly it had to be secured in law. That was very important for him. So to see him sort of say that, and that's always one of my, I pause every time I read that, even if I've read it for the 100th time, because he's saying something so important. You can't make a man love his neighbor through an act of law. You can't do that. That doesn't happen that way. So democracy can't be built only with these legal building blocks. They are necessary, but are they sufficient? That's the question that he raises fairly early on. And which is why, therefore, it becomes important for us, as Balagopal understood very well, that you see his fight against caste and his fight as a Democrat as part of a seamless whole. You can't separate the two. They are both very, very important. And how do you then read Ambedkar for a civil rights cause? That becomes a good question for us to ask. I think Balagopal does it in a certain way. He does it in the sense of, if you're fighting caste, what are you fighting? Brahmanical Hinduism in some in a very fundamental way. So he raises the question of um, Brahmanism should be a legitimate object of critique for the civil rights movement. And I think that is revolutionary in terms of thinking about civil rights itself. Because you're basically challenging a given ideology, a given way of living, a given way of thinking about things. So how would a civil rights movement do that? And that's very important because I think his whole thing, he goes on about Brahmanism and all his essays on Mandal, in his annotations. Anyone who's read that book knows where all that term comes and how he uses it. And especially after Gujarat 2002, that becomes very central to his critique of, in fact, even earlier. In fact, in his 1990s writings, he has a very prescient sense of Hindutva, that these fellows are going to come and rule us very soon. So, and much of that understanding comes from his critique of caste. And that's something that we seldom make. That connection is rarely made between caste and Hindutva. Hindutva is seen as a political fascism, but Hindutva is very, very rarely seen as linked to a kind of everyday social practice, And I think Balagopal points that out, that you have to make that connection between caste and Hindutva in a very fundamental way. So therefore, Brahmanism becomes a legitimate object of action for the civil rights movement. And in his own way, how did he think about it? And I was just telling Arvind, he wrote a series of essays on the Manusmriti in Telugu, for a Telugu audience. I don't know where it was published, maybe Svecha, I'm not sure. I don't think it was translated into English. It's thankfully translated into Tamil from the Telugu. So it's very interesting. He's introducing the Manusmriti, basically saying that, this is a text that we all ought to know because this really, as Arvind started by saying, if we say caste is the law, where is that coming from? It is not that all of us read the Manusmriti to be like whatever the Manusmriti wants us to be. As Ambedkar himself pointed out, you don't have to even know that the Manusmriti exists, but you can still behave like how it tells you to behave. You don't have to know the text at all. So that whole way of being which Brahmanism has naturalized has made it possible for many of us to think in a certain way, And I think that's Balagopal goes one step and asks us, this is what Manusmriti says. And here again, I think Ambedkar's influence is very evident because Ambedkar was obsessed with the Manusmriti. It's like, I think he quotes it, I don't know, in so many different texts. Why was he obsessed with the Manusmriti? Apart from the fact that much of what it has, we understand by caste, is sort of taken from it or from the other Dharma Shastras or from commentaries on Manusmriti or whatever. That is, of course, at one level. But at another level, as lawyers again will appreciate this, Ambedkar found the Manusmriti particularly problematic for how it dealt with what today we would call criminal law. It says, all the civil disabilities it imposes on people, that's one thing. All cultures have known that. We just didn't have certain civil rights before democracy and the republic became a possibility. You had that in France, you had that. But no, very few legal regimes, and here of course he cites Roman law mostly, Ambedkar. Even the Roman Empire didn't have graded punishments. Roman law was problematic in many ways, but even it didn't have graded punishment. Now what did he mean by that? The punishment for murder is different if you're a Brahmin, if you're a Kshatriya, if you're a Dalit, if you're a woman. And the Manusmriti is so specific about who can be a slave, who can be a slave to whom, and who can't be a slave to whom, who can be a dhasi to whom, who can't be a dhasi to whom. So it is so clearly worked out the details of slavery even. So if criminal law is graded like this, which means that you don't recognize crime in the singular. Wrongdoing is never wrongdoing universally. Some people do it, it's okay, you can condone it. Others do it, you can kill them, you can torture them. So this sort of discrepancy in criminal law bothered Ambedkar, the lawyer that he was, of course, but also it went against any notion of universal justice. So, which is why, again, very interestingly, to come back to his thing about love, this is so interesting because Manusmriti, its very tenets are against universal justice, and for Ambedkar, the problem is how has that way of thinking about justice stayed with us? We don't have a sense of universal justice. It is not that we are bad people. He's not saying that. He says we are not bad people. But the Hindu is nice to only people who are of his own kind. He's not nice to people who are not like him. And he, of course, uses caste, but we can extend it to any sort of social community because that caste mentality, as we call it, it seeps into various other ways of life. So that's Ambedkar's thing. I mean, he's basically saying that. So it's very evident that we think like the Manusmriti wants us to think, that there is no universal justice, which means there's no possibility of equality, right? Only if we are all equal can there be universal justice. So within this, there's no possibility of equality. And then love becomes important for Ambedkar, therefore. So in 1934, after the Pune Pact is signed, and Gandhi and he are actually in a mood of, there's some bonhomie at that point. Ambedkar even says, sometimes when I listen to Gandhi, I think he really thinks like us. This is sometime in 32, 33. Before that comes unraveling afterwards. But this is the time when the Harijan Sevak Sangh is emerging. Gandhi has promised that he will make sure caste Hindus repent and they do things for Dalits and so on. So Ambedkar writes a letter at that time to the founder of the Anti-Untouchability League, A.B. Thakkar. And he says, I don't know what you people are going to do in this organization. As far as I'm concerned, this should be like a civil rights organization. You have to stand by the Dalits in their struggles for rights. And he goes on and on to explain what that means. And he says, we don't want you to be a charitable organization. Dalits, and I'll just summarize what he said. Dalits don't want education for themselves in a separate school. They want to go to a common school. And he goes on in his vein. And he said, that's what they want. And he says, you can say that people must repent and they must suffer a change of heart and their conscience must be. So all that's fine. I mean, all that can happen. But don't forget that at best that can improve a single person's behavior. But what we are looking at here is group violence. People are reacting to Dalits as members of a particular group as well. And that needs challenging upfront. You have to create a situation where people won't do that. And you have to do that, and you can only do that if you fight against it. And Dalits will challenge it, we have to be on their side. And that's when he says that a little short of the affection one gets in a family, the only other way in which love can be made available to all of Dalits is through justice. So he conflates justice and love. It's a fantastic passage. Huh? He just says it and he moves on. He doesn't sort of dwell on it. But you go back and you read it, you see how he's trying to actually pull many things together. And I think therefore, when Balagopal says that we should take our cues from Ambedkar, is bringing together his democratic concerns and his anti-caste concerns. One is of course to challenge Brahminism, but the other thing is also how to build a culture of democracy where justice is conflated with love. I think that is a challenge for us, right? And Balagopal would come to it in his own way. I don't think he would use the word love. No, he won't. But he would use other terms that are quite congruent in some interesting ways. But I think what Ambedkar does in his own way in conflating these things is to suggest that look, we've got to build something that's different. And sadly, we never think of the building Ambedkar as we think of the naysaying Ambedkar. We're constantly seeing Ambedkar as a critic. But Ambedkar was also a builder, no? He was a state builder, he was an institution builder, he was an educator. No educator can be negative alone. And I just want us to spend a little time thinking about that as well, because to build a democratic culture, you need to build. How do you build? And I just want to give you an example of Ambedkar tried to build something mentally. Because for him, many things had to also be in the realm of ideas, minds, how you understand some things, and of course how you act and what you do. And again, a very brief sort of thing. If you look at the Mahat Satyagraha, the Mahat Satyagraha it's quite fascinating in many ways. He starts out, the first phase of the Satyagraha, he does whatever he does in terms of why should we be doing this, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, look, what we're doing is so important. It's like all these French people who wanted to overthrow the monarchy and gathered in the tennis court and declared themselves a constituent assembly. That's what they do, before they make that French Revolution. So basically, he's elevating a particular struggle into a normative value, valid across geographies and across histories. He's saying, don't think you're just going to go drink water and all that. It's not that. And then he annotates the Declaration of the Rights of Man for this audience in Marathi. So he's basically placing the Mahat Satyagraha within the context of French Revolutionary history. And particularly that whole meeting at the tennis court that was held in Versailles, in any textbook we were all meant to memorize these facts, no? That is where they decided that they will form a constituent assembly and so on. So for Ambedkar, this is the beginning of something that could constitute a new understanding of democracy itself. And then later on, when they burned the Manusmriti, then he invokes the Protestant Revolution. This is what Luther did. Remember, he took away power from those priests and then he nailed these things on the walls and said, now come on, everybody read the Bible. So basically, he saw himself as he located Dalit struggles within, at least at that time, what was seen as two very important moments in the history of human progress. One is the secular revolution of the French Jacobins. The other is the spiritual revolution of the English Protestants, German and English Protestants. And Ambedkar uses them sort of fearlessly to comment on Indian history. So the Mahat Satyagraha becomes a part of this revolutionary world history. The burning of the Manusmriti becomes a kind of a critique of clergy everywhere. So look, we are also like them, they are also like us. So in that way, see what he's building is he's saying, look, we have to locate ourselves there. We belong to this big history. When you're saying democracy, that's where we all are. And then again, temple entry, that's the next thing that he picks up. He gets very tired of it very soon because it's not getting anywhere. Kalaram temple entry, the British are not in a mood to respond. And again, we're all familiar, law and order issues, 144 is there, I mean, nothing's happening. And that's the time when the Congress says we'll pass a temple entry bill, blah, blah. Then Ambedkar says, wait a minute. If you're passing the temple entry bill, you assume that Dalits are Hindus and you let them in. But how can we accept in Hinduism that has Chaturvarna at its core? We can't. So we can't stop halfway and say that we'll get into the temple. We also want to challenge Chaturvarna. Now if you don't allow us to do that, this temple entry bill has no meaning for us. It has no meaning because it's just going to give us rights of access. But rights of access should come with the right of critique also. And if you don't allow us to do that, that means that you are you're temporizing with evil, he says. Those are the terms he uses. He uses very Christian terms, You're temporizing with evil. You're going against the very sacredness of the human personality. I mean, it meant so much to him that this power of critique should be granted to us. You can't just say, okay, come into our temples. No. Once we come there, we'll also say we don't like the way you're running this society. But you can't say I will stop with this and I won't go ahead to what is next. So again, is amplifying the meaning of access. What does access mean? Access is also invitation to critique, to thinking aloud. So when you come to annihilation of caste, I don't know if you remember that text, whoever has read it, towards the very end, being the Democrat, after telling the Arya Samajis that your religion is unreformable, he pauses and he says, but if you wish to reform, go ahead. For me, that's the most moving and funny part of the text. Knowing fully well it won't happen, but yet wanting to be fair, you wish to reform, go ahead. But that can only be a conversion, he says. Reform can't be reform, it has to be a conversion. You have to convert into another sort of person who will value liberty, equality, fraternity. You can't have new wine in old bottles, it won't work. You have to become another sort of person. So the building blocks of democracy require a complete sort of self-transformation from what he's saying. And he would go on to say such things in different points in time, but these are very important iconic moments for me. And then of course he tells Mahars of Bombay that I'm going to convert at some point. I don't know what you all want to do, but this is what I'm going to do. And then Buddhism of course becomes his final choice and all of that. So we have to see Ambedkar's Buddhism not in instrumental terms, that it was a political decision. It was also an ethical decision for him, because he wanted a worldview that would be the antithesis of Brahmanism. And whether Buddhism is that exactly, we leave it to the historians. But for Ambedkar, it was certainly a very different sort of way of being and thinking. Now, Samula Balagopal, what's he going to do with this heritage? It's an interesting question to ask. I don't think Balagopal was interested in Buddhism, nor was he interested in the question of conversion. He would have defended the right to convert, that's different. He would have stood by religious constituencies like he did with Simi if their fundamental rights are being thwarted, that's different. But whether he viewed this transformation of the self in those terms, whether he sort of saw that legacy in that question is interesting. I haven't read anything which suggests that he did. But then there may be other Telugu writings, I don't know. But what I find interesting is Balagopal comes to this in his own way though, not in this manner, that remaking democracy would require you to place yourself within a different historical chronology, a different sort of world, context and all that. And what he says about human rights Balagopal's whole manner of thinking about human rights, that it is not something that can be decided by the framework of uh, socialist revolution. That's one thing is very clear. Then what can define it? Are you going to sort of work towards creating this new self then, this new barrier of rights? Who is this person? What will this person do and not do? And he raises that question also. He says, why should I be fighting for farmers as a civil rights person when there's a Kisan movement? Why should I be fighting for the rights of women when there's a feminist movement? So what is it that I can do as a human rights organization? Basically, if Brahmanism is going to be my target, how do I target it? And I think that's where for him, this whole critique of caste, Manusmriti and Brahmanism, pedagogic or critical or whatever it is, becomes a very central task of the human rights movement. You of course attend to particular instances of violence and you will do what you need to do as lawyers, as analysts, but you also need to think of a way of criticizing Brahmanism within a human rights perspective, and that shouldn't be difficult because, as you often said, caste is a violation of human rights in itself. But why is it so difficult for us to come to that position as a human rights organization? And then he vouchsafes his own answer. Says part of the problem is, of course, in a very simplistic way, many of us who are in civil rights groups are all from the upper caste, and we never really had to work at caste on ourselves. We never really had to do that. So for us, it was not like, self-evident that this is an issue. But Dalits pointed out that this is very central to a decent civic life. So what do we do then? And I think he then goes on to say, particularly in the context of the subcategorization issue in Andhra Pradesh, Mala Madiga, the subcategorization issue, he says, why has it raised so many questions for us about caste, about graded inequality is this, that somewhere in each of us, there is a bit of the caste halo. So to fight for civil rights is to fight against oneself, somewhere at some level. So what does that mean in practical terms? That's again the same question. Now we can go back to Ambedkar. For Ambedkar, what did it mean? Today we use words like allyship, we say pass the mic and so on. Ambedkar would have been more elegant in his use of language. He, go back and read that letter to Thakur. A.V. Thakur, the letter to A.V. Thakur, I think, is a classic statement of what any of us who's in caste society, Dalits or non-Dalits, who might have a bit of that caste being in ourselves, what do you do then? So for Ambedkar, like everything else, you risk a wager. You come out and you say that this is what you'll be doing and this is where you're going to be there. And he wanted that. He didn't want this self-confessional thing of, this is a very Americanized approach, right? You come out and you say, I'm entitled, I'm privileged, I'm standing on native land. That doesn't change anything. It's not going to take away my privilege, but basically you support the rights of those who are denied privileges by working along with them, being there in practical terms for the work that they are doing. So that's something he tells A.V. Thakur. That's what I would like you to do. And let Dalits take the lead because they know what it is that affects them and they will sort of take that agenda forward, just as women's groups know what to do with the gender question. So these are issues that he talks about, and I think that whole thing of reflective, self-reflexivity about the self is the closest Balagopal comes to conversion. The closest it comes to conversion. But then there is so much constant thinking and agonizing about how do we do this human rights work, that at some level it becomes a very existential question for him, like in that essay on violence and non-violence, which you've written about. Everybody knows that. But there are no answers to that question, basically. But it's a question we can't stop reflecting on. And I think he does that. And then he raises some very poignant questions. And this is where I feel this side of Balagopal that likes literature and poetry and music is completely lost to us. Because at one point he says, when it comes to theft, for example, petty theft, obviously whatever the courts do, keep them in remand under trials for years, and you have to fight and you can't legally say that this is not tenable. But at the same time, you have to remember that petty theft is also at the expense of another poor person. Somebody who's stolen a bicycle has taken it from a poor man also, or a poor person. So how do you hold these things together? It's an important question, right? So how do you define crime to the world? So civil rights groups should also define criminality in different ways. And that's a very poignant thing to be saying, because a man who's lost his bicycle is also poor. So how do you talk about crime at all in this manner, and how do you think about the criminal in this context? And that wonderful essay on the two men who set that bus on fire, remember?
Mm.
Then they were awarded the death penalty, and then it was revoked, no? Finally, the death penalty was revoked. So in that case, the way he writes about it is very, very interesting. And because, and this I know because I had personal correspondence with him on the subject for a little while. He was also very troubled by the notion of the human person. Who is this human being? Why do we assume that we're always capable of the best things that we are capable of? There's a lot in us that's not okay. Thoughts in us that are negative. That the human person is very complex. And I remember we had these long conversations about Freud and this and that. And at that time he was sort of mocked at for being interested in psychoanalysis and psychology and so on. The far left was very disdainful. Why would you want to read any of this stuff? But he was interested in the human condition, our capacity for being really bad people. And he said that is true of all of us. And he also felt that it was against the dignity of any working class or a Dalit or a person from the margins to say that is an incredibly good human being. No, that's doing great injury, because as human beings we are imperfect creatures trying to be perfect. So that is the mark of our humanity. You can't deny that humanity to the poor or to the Dalits. And this is important because Cornel West, the American theologian and writer, once said that famous case against Clarence Thomas was a black judge, and then Anita Hill was a black intern, testified against him, and then the black community was split into two, with the older generation saying we shouldn't show him up, and the younger generation of feminists saying buzz off, behave badly. And Cornel West wrote this very interesting essay at that time saying that if you are to accept the African American in all their humanity, you must allow for their choices, right or wrong. Because those choices are what makes us human. You choose to be wrong also, no? So in that sense, that's what makes you human. And I think it is in these ways that Balagopal reveals to us a certain deep empathy for the human condition. In a very different sense from Ambedkar, of course, but I don't know, many of us might not feel like converting, we might not think religion is anything, we may not have that sense at all, but we're all troubled by many things. So how do you sort of bring these two things together is something worth thinking about. Now I just want to end with one last thing, and this I think is to go back to love and law. I want to write a book called Love and Law. Because that whole thing of I can't make a man love, I think that's also at the heart of Ambedkar's dilemma with the law. And Balagopal's dilemma with the law also. What can the law do and what can it not do? And not to take extreme positions on both things. Because I think he was so sort of fed up with the far left's position on seeing the law as an instrument. And he makes his case for rights as civilizational values. At the same time, as a practical lawyer who went to court and the labor of being a head of the drafting committee and working on the constitution, he also knew how the law at any point in time can only reflect the consensus we are capable of at that moment in history. So laws will be amended. Laws will have to sort of be taken ahead, reworked. That's also something he was very aware of. That's why whereas as a head of the Scheduled Caste Federation, and he prepares a memorandum for the Fundamental Rights Committee, that states and minorities, where he explicitly says that there must be state socialism of one kind or the other. He explicitly says that later on during the Constituent Assembly debates, he refuses to have the word socialist added into the Constitution, saying you can't define the nature of the polity beforehand. So it's very interesting, it's not a contradiction. Basically, he realizes, I think, for them it was a huge educative process also being part of the Constituent Assembly. He felt negative about it sometimes, but if you read all the documents around the Constitution, you know that he was not negative during the process. And this fantastic new book on founding mothers of the Republic by Achyut Chetan, it tells you how much these women and Ambedkar worked together. It's so interesting. There's so much give and take. It was an educative process that lawmaking is historical. Founding mothers of the Republic. Law is historical, and the constitutions you create will reflect what is a consensual thing at that point in time. At the same time, these norms of our constitution have the capacity to transcend their time. So how do we retain that sense of what will remain and what needs to be addressed. This is a question for every lawmaker, for every society, and that Ambedkar was very, very aware of. Which is why when the last speech we all know, no? I mean, we're going to give ourselves this constitution, we don't know how it's going to be, it's a palace built on a dung heap, we have social and economic, we all know that speech. But that speech reveals a great anguish also, that the making of the constitution is meaningful because that will be the basis for constitutional morality, a morality that's not linked to Manusmriti or caste or anything, right? And for Ambedkar, that's very, very important. See, during the Hindu Code Bill debates, I think it was Renuka Ray or Sucheta Kriplani, I forget which one, the women are arguing for the Hindu Code Bill. And this is another misnomer that nobody supported him. That's not true. He had a lot of support in the legislative wing. All the women supported him. Number of Gandhians supported him. It was not without support. It's a political decision not to have the Hindu Code Bill. But the interesting thing in that debate is, I think Sucheta Kriplani says, unless you give us the Hindu Code Bill, the fundamental rights are useless for us. Basically say you've got to address our situation as dependent wives, as reproducers who are not given a choice with marriage or divorce or adoption. If we don't have these rights, what do fundamental rights mean for us? And Ambedkar at that point, in the course of the discussion, he would also affirm that argument. But also interestingly, Hansa Mehta says these divorce laws don't go far enough. And Ambedkar says, I know they don't, but I just want to say this, that for the first time in our history, we have given ourselves a law. This is not given by God, this is not given by Manu, this is not given by X, Y, and Z. We have giving ourselves this law. So that was his maximalist interest in the constitution and in the Hindu code book. His minimalist thing was, this is not revolutionary. The Hindu code, see again we try and say that he resigned because of the Hindu code book. Perhaps that was one reason, but nowhere in the debates do you see him saying that it's revolutionary. He said it's the bare minimum you need for being a decent society. And he constantly says, your Shastras only are saying this, why are you opposing it? Your whatever commentator only is saying it, why are you opposing it? And he held meetings with every existing Orthodox Hindu community to find out what their views are. Because that whole experience of being in the Constituent Assembly was, you cannot make a law in such a complicated, unwieldy society, and you cannot expect constitutional morality to take root like that. It's very, very difficult. And Tushar Mehta proved it so well last week. No, seriously, I think it's a serious thing. I mean, how can he say it, apart from it being polemical and horrible and in his usual nasty way, but it is also the fact that who discusses constitutional morality? Where is that ever a subject of debate or thinking or pedagogy or anything, frankly? At very best we read the preamble, but what does it mean to say constitutional morality? Ambedkar basically felt you have to have a way of being and acting which draws from these universal principles, and who teaches that to anybody? Any moral science education you have is still based on the Puranas, still based on the Bible, still based on this, that and the other. So in that sense, we have done nothing to sort of actually root constitutional morality anywhere, except in particular judgments, in particular laws maybe. But as a society, why are we surprised with this fellow saying this? Where has it taken root? So he was in despair. But that was but the minimal thing was, yes, we need these things. But whether it will take root, we don't know. We have to see how it goes. And Balagopal comes to that same position. See, we have no guarantees. We have absolutely no guarantees. But we have to act as if we need guarantees. We have to believe in these things. We have to build on this democratic culture. We have no other choice. I was just telling Arvind, very naive me back when I was in my late 20s, was asked to assist him in editing the APCLC reports. It was a horrible experience because you're reading these nasty accounts of torture and Andhra police's sort of various nasty stuff. And I would go home and be sleepless, and when I was editing, not a word would pass between us. It was all of that. And then there were all this list of demands at the end of the fact-finding report, asking the government to do this, do that, whatever. At one point, I gathered courage and I asked him, I can't only sleep reading all this. You write all of these reports and you have these demands of the same government that's torturing you. He just looked at me and said, what choice do we have? So basically, I think that it's a wager, no? It's the wager in democracy. And he does that. He, just like Ambedkar wagered on constitutional morality. I think in that sense, I think it's quite a fascinating thing for us to think about. What can the law do, what can it not do? Because for me at least, I don't know about some of your students in NLS and all that, they are so taken in by this sort of absolutist critique of the law that comes from Agamben, from various other European characters in the plush comfort of European welfareism, it's easy to say